Why do we call the 2000s the aughts? If you enjoy videos like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment your favorite decade name below. Most decades are easy to name. It takes no thought at all to realize we're in the 20s, and just about every other decade is equally easy. The 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and teens. Then there's the first decade of the 21st century. Why do we refer to that period of time from 2000 to 2009 using the aughts? The meaning of aught. The aughts was suggested because of those double zeros. Aught, or aught, means zero, and it's actually a corruption of the older word naught, which dates all the way back to Old English. If you recognize it, it's likely from the expression, all for naught. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, aught and aught emerged in the 1800s. The oldest known example appeared in Maria Edgeworth's 1822 book, Frank, a sequel to Frank in Early Lessons. It was said that all Cambridge scholars call the cipher aught and all Oxford scholars call it naught. While we tend to refer to the beginning of the 20th century as the 1900s today, according to Slate, the aughts was one of the most common terms for that period of time in that era, which was apparently a logical extension of the fact that Americans living at the turn of the century referred to individual years as aughts, meaning zero, as in 1901, 1902, and so on. Aughts versus noughties. Another term for the first decade of this century, used mostly in the UK and Australia, has been successful enough to make it into the Oxford English Dictionary, the noughties, or sometimes the naughties. The term has actually been around since at least a 1989 William Safire column in the New York Times, where he talked about what to call the first decade of the new millennium. He wrote, "That postcard touches on several possibilities suggested by scores of third millennium freaks. The naughties was suggested by 40 readers. Then in a 1991 New Scientist article, the term popped up again, this time with a bit of a finger-wagging tone. With regard to Richard Kay's question about suitable names for the next 2 decades, considering the moral decline of society as a whole, the next decade must surely be the noughties. By 1999 though, the question of what to call the upcoming decade was still totally unsettled. The BBC even noted, no one seems to have been able to provide an answer to the puzzle of what the next decade will be called. The noughties could be the one to head the, admittedly sorry, list of contenders, but honestly, hardly anyone says naughties or naughties today, probably because it sounds a bit like a schoolmarm scolding a child, or as the BBC put it, a polite middle-class code for the reproductive organs, which is a funny way to talk about a decade, no matter how you look at it. What's in a name? Interestingly enough, even during the aughts, there wasn't universal agreement on what to call them. As linguist and language columnist Ben Zimmer wrote at the Oxford University Press blog, "It's a curious situation. Here we are at the end of 2007, and we still lack a commonly accepted term for the current decade. Very often English speakers deal with this quandary by employing the strategy of no naming, a term that sociolinguists use to describe the avoidance of address terms when one is unsure what to call one's interlocutor. You can hear this kind of no naming when a radio station announces that it plays hits from the 80s, 90s, and today. But that's hardly a satisfying solution. Surely we can do better in the next 2 years before the decade runs out." Zimmer ran down several suggested monikers for the decade, which included everything from the 2000s to names like the nillies, the deckies, the double zeros, the OOs, and the pre-teens. But none of those terms really made the jump into common usage. For whatever reason, it seems like the aughts, archaic or not, gets the job done. Though, as staff writer Rebecca Mead wrote at The New Yorker in 2009, it wasn't exactly a perfect solution. The adoption of the aughts, as the decade's name, only accelerates the almost complete obsolescence of the actual English word aught, a concise and poetic near synonym for anything that has for centuries well-served writers, including Shakespeare. To call the decade the aughts is a compromise that pleases no one, and that has more than a whiff of resigned settling about it.